Ghost of a Memory by Phoenix Boy. Chapter 17. Early on a Saturday afternoon, James sat in the staff room working steadily through a pile of first-year essays. They were really the worst of the lot. They'd got past the stage when everything, including the homework, was new and exciting, and their subject matter was boring enough that they weren't putting much time into it. It was standard practice at this time, so a number of the other teachers were also there, laughing over some of the funnier mistakes, chatting about various families or students. Professor Sprout and Madame Hooch were both in Hogsmeade with their families, a fact which they had carefully kept secret from their students. Severus looked over at James from the desk next to him. "Isn't Miss Weasley arriving soon?" James panicked for a moment before realizing that this was referring to Hermione. It made her sound so old. 3:00, he replied, though I'm fairly sure she'll be early. She knows where to find me, though, so I'm going to see how much more I can get done. First years, Severus said knowingly. Unfortunately, some of their answers, they seem to have no idea of geography. I don't even know if they've been taught it at all. This last one seems to think Nairobi is the capital of Finland. Why? Who knows? Tell me, do wizard-born children normally get taught the basics? I assume you had a mostly muggle childhood, Severus said, only a hint of a sneer in his voice. My mother was born into a squibb line, and I was raised with my cousin. I went to a standard muggle school until I was pulled out at age 11 for a proper education, James explained. It was perfect truth, according to his research, yet didn't give away too much about his home life. Do you know anything much about our system, then? Not really. The subjects taught depend on their parents' wishes. Mostly children are taught by their parents or by a tutor hired by their parents. There is the occasional small school around where parents have pooled their resources, but mostly it's just within a family. Some subjects are standard. They all have to read and write, for instance, and do some basic mathematics. It's also advised that they are taught the very basics of some of the magical subjects, potions in particular. And I believe also herbology. My father was particularly keen on my beginning a magical education early, so I also did history of magic potions and began to study the dark arts. Something like geography would be rare. That can't be that much work. How long do they spend on lessons? James asked, surprised. He had thought that all of his friends would have had much the same lessons hours as him. 8:30 in the morning until 3:30 in the evening. He'd stayed behind for every club there was to keep himself out of the house, normally meaning he didn't get home until about 5. Oh, mostly they work in the mornings from about 8 to 12, then have the rest of the day to do what they please. 4 hours. Less, really, considering they get breaks. No wonder they have problems doing their assignments. What do you think? From the age of 3, I was in school in compulsory lessons from 8:30 to 3:30, with breaks, of course, but still most of that was in lessons. I assure you that I followed a similar program. I would say that was the exception rather than the rule. Perhaps it is less surprising that after the initial culture shock, Muggle-born students tend to do better. Your friend being a prime example. That reminds me, reports will be compiled and sent home soon, and we will be having meetings with the parents of the first-year Muggle-born students over the next week. They are often a little uncomfortable with letting their children go off to a boarding school they have never heard of, to be taught by people who, to them, undoubtedly seem a little strange. We are to cover the 3 in Slytherin. I will see Mr. and Mrs. Richards and Mr. and Mrs. Wilkinson. However, Mrs. MacDonald, when I last saw her, seemed to be very overprotective. I would appreciate it if you would accompany me for that interview, since you have a superior understanding of the Muggle system. Certainly. Do I need to do anything about the reports? If you have read the memo sent round, you would know. No, you do not, since you have already submitted the grades for this term's work. I have written a general report on progress for each student in the house, and that is all that is necessary. Okay then. I better go now. I would appreciate it if you would update me on your findings. Slytherin's own childhood home. It would certainly be a fascinating place to visit. Sure. James piled his essays up and shoved them into a drawer. He was seriously considering issuing the students with Muggle-style exercise books next year. Parchment was all very well and looked very nice, but handwriting seemed to suffer, and it was so much harder to organize. During his own school days, he had found it challenging to manage not to lose all of his notes or get them muddled. He wandered down to the library, as he'd suspected. Hermione rushed in a moment later, clipboard in hand. On it, she had a list of possible reading material. Afternoon, James. she said. "I've already looked through some sources I found, and I've managed to compile a list of books we could start by looking at. Here, you try and find the ones on this sheet, and I'll work down the other two." James found himself presented with a very muggle-looking sheet of A4 paper with about 20 titles written down in Hermione's tiny, neat handwriting. He moved off towards the shelves behind her. Before long, they had a large pile of books on the table in front of them. Hermione looked at it critically, then around the library at the groups of students working there. "We'll go back to your rooms to look through this. I'll just go and get them issued by Madame Pince. I have a feeling she wouldn't let you take this many out on your own." James watched helplessly as she thrust most of the books into his arms and marched up to the desk. "Hermione, dear, good to see you looking so well," Madame Pince said, thawing considerably from her usually cold self. "What brings you to Hogwarts?" "I'm doing some research with Professor Evans. These are some books I need to take back to his quarters. A starting point, really. There are a few more I'd like to come back for, and I'd love to get that copy of The Founding of Hogwarts by Friedrich Firmage out for some light reading." Madame Pince chuckled indulgently at the young woman who quite probably had been her favorite student of the past few years. She was one of the few who loved books and reading and could be trusted to look after the books as they deserved to be looked after, unlike most of the young hooligans who used the library. The now issued books were once again piled in James's arms, and Hermione led the way back through the corridors down to the dungeons. Minerva McGonagall, walking up to the headmaster's office for afternoon tea, stopped short as she saw them pass. She knew in hindsight that she was just imagining things, but that picture had brought back so many dear memories. Young Miss Granger being trailed by either one or two boys, their arms piled high with books and a black head poking over one pile. What she would give for Hermione Granger and Harry Potter to have returned to Hogwarts together. When they reached the dungeons, Hermione had James put the books down carefully on the floor, and they sat down next to them. "The first thing we need to do is sort them out into what they're about. I think we'll need 3 piles. No, 4. 1 each for the Gryffindor family and the Slytherin family. We'll have to include books on Godric and Salazar in those. 1 can be for any details on the founding of Hogwarts. The last can be for history textbooks about Wizarding Britain during that time period. I think you'd better take the Slytherin pile to start with, since you said you'd already done some research into him, and I'll start with the more general history textbooks." James looked at the piles, the history pile considerably larger than any of the others, and hastily agreed. An hour later, he summoned a house elf to fetch them some refreshments. Hermione agreed to this on the condition that they were kept over on his desk, away from the books. By 6 o'clock, when they had to move and start getting ready for dinner, they had each got through their assigned piles. From the large piles, they had each found 1 or 2 books that might contain relevant references. James had enjoyed the afternoon surprisingly much, partly because Salazar Slytherin was such a fascination to him, partly because it gave him some time when he could be himself and talk about his past without having to lie and hide it all. Before they called it a day, they carried all the books they no longer needed back to the library and checked them back in, restoring them carefully to the shelves from whence they came. "Are you staying for supper here?" James asked her. "No, we eat at the Burrow on Saturdays. I'll operate home and flew with Ron." "Have a good evening." "You know, you'd probably be welcome to come some evening," Hermione said, remembering how much he had enjoyed his rare time at the Burrow. "It's okay," he said. "Just remember to tell me all about it. I've sort of got my own family now, what with Draco and Abe. They seem determined to adopt me." "Good for them. Well, shall we continue same time next week?" "I'd appreciate that if you have the time." Hermione grinned at him and started back down the main path to the apparition point. James watched her go. In some ways he envied her, but really he knew that he would never have completely fit into the family life of the Weasleys. He was too Slytherin by far, and as much as he loved them, they had never really understood him. The following evening, Draco dragged James down to his quarters for a drink. Blaise had taken Harry up to the staff room, where both mother and child would be fussed over by every female member of staff, plus Albus, who never had been able to resist a baby. James poured them each a mug of butterbeer, and they sat down in front of the fireplace. "So how's the love life getting on?" Draco asked a moment later. "Is everyone obsessed with my life?" James exclaimed. "That's just what Abe asked me last month." "We just want you to be happy," Draco said, smiling angelically. "A Professor Dumbledore requested that I ensure that you never lack for good advice. I'm also meant to owl him anything of interest. Now spill!" Draco, I am in a school. Perhaps you noticed that there aren't that many adult guys in a school, even fewer who are gay. And since you're not going out at weekends and the evenings to look for company, it stands to reason that there's already someone you like. Since I know it's not me, it must be Sev. Does he know? I never said I liked Severus. James protested helplessly. Bloody Draco, he'd always been far too perceptive. But you knew, didn't you? Well, as I thought. Have you told him yet? No, James said, then swore violently as he realized he'd just confirmed his friend's suspicions. So how serious is it then? I don't know. Think it through. Do you want a one-off, short-term, or long-term? Definitely more than a one-off unless something drastic happens. I guess I like him a lot. Enough for a long-term relationship? I think so. Good, because Sam isn't likely to settle for less. I'm thinking you're moving slowly so as not to surprise him too much. Are you planning on staying in Hogwarts for a while then? Probably. I don't think there's anywhere else I'm dying to go. I don't want to work as an Auror or as a professional Quidditch player, and definitely not at the Ministry. Curse breaking might be interesting, but I think this job suits me as well as anything. I have some plans that I'd like to see through, but I don't think it's going to be happening anytime soon. You always were a sucker for kids! Don't tell him I said this, but Severus is, even more so than you. So long as he doesn't have to teach him, he's brilliant with them. Spoiled me rotten when I was younger. Still does, actually. There was this one time, I must have been about 6 when he was visiting. Lucius must have been at the Ministry and Mother was out shopping with friends. We were meant to be doing some potions, but as soon as they left, he got out his broomstick and took me for a ride. I absolutely loved it. Then the house elf that was my nanny snitched on us to my mother and I was grounded and I think he was told off. Your mother told him off, James asked incredulously. That's what I remember. Of course, he was only about our age then and no one seems to worry about telling us off. Too true, James agreed. Teacher or no, he was still the baby of the staff room. Of course, it's not like we've ever done anything to deserve this sort of attention, Draco continued. It's all Bertie's fault, James whined. I didn't do anything. They both burst out laughing. Yep, there was absolutely no reason the pair of them had managed to obtain a reputation for being the worst troublemakers in Merlin House. It was Bertram Highcastle who had done everything they'd been blamed for. How is Bertram anyway? James asked. I assume you've heard from him more recently than I have. If you'd actually replied to letters, you might get more mail. He's much the same as ever. At the moment, he's in London, I think. His hair was almost an ultraviolet color last time I saw him, and his latest boyfriend was some German fellow. Of course, knowing him, all of this is completely out of date. Any sign of a job? You think anyone would employ him? No, and it's not like he needs one given that his family owns that patent for the Skelegro potion. At least he hasn't decided to go into politics. The worst thing is, I think he'd be extremely popular. Please, Minister Highcastle, I want there to be a ministry-run nightclub to raise our public image. James simpered, then he laughed. The worst thing is that he'd probably agree to that. On Wednesday afternoon, both James and Severus's lessons were cancelled as they headed towards Diagon Alley. Severus was wearing his teaching robes. As senior professor, he felt he should look reputable. James, being Muggleborn, didn't feel robes were so necessary, so he was wearing black trousers and a green dress shirt, the idea being to look casual and approachable, but still respectable. They had agreed to meet up with Mrs. MacDonald at 4 o'clock in the Leaky Cauldron, where they had booked one of the private meeting rooms for their discussion. James had volunteered to wait outside, just in case she had problems getting in. Since Muggle parents were normally accompanied by their children, they could sometimes have problems when coming alone. He had previously been shown a photograph of her, so he wouldn't seem so much of an idiot. At 3:15, James saw a woman he thought to be Mrs. MacDonald walking down the street towards him, looking anxiously from side to side, as if not quite sure of where she was going. As she seemed to be about to walk straight past the Leaky Cauldron, he stepped forward. Mrs. MacDonald? He asked. She nodded, surprised. I am Professor Evans. The Leaky Cauldron is just to your right. If you would step in, we've booked a private room for our discussion. Thank you. I was so worried I'd walk straight past you. No problem. Did you have a good journey? James asked as he pushed open the door to the inn and led the way through the crowded room, nodding politely to Tom as they passed. He'd caught the barman giving him some odd looks and wasn't quite sure of the reason, so he decided to play it safe. If he did have suspicions about James's identity, he certainly hadn't seemed inclined to air them yet. As they entered the room, Severus stood up politely to shake her hand. "A pleasure to see you again, Mrs. MacDonald."
"Professor Snape, isn't it?"
"Indeed. Please, take a seat. You have met my colleague, Professor Evans, haven't you?"
"Oh, yes, such a polite young man."
"That's debatable," James heard Severus mutter. He wondered absently if Draco had been telling tales on him. "I thought you might prefer it if we gave you a basic summary of how Alistair is doing at school, and then you can ask any questions you wish."
"Oh, that sounds absolutely fine to me. I admit I have been quite worried about him recently, what with Mr. MacDonald away in America and not due back until next week."
"I'm sure he's written to tell you that he was sorted into Slytherin House, so I am now his housemaster, and James here is my deputy."
"Your houses work much like those at normal schools, don't they?"
Severus looked helplessly at James, who stepped smoothly in. "In most ways, yes. Hogwarts is a relatively small school, so all students live in the castle. There are 4 houses altogether, each with approximately 70 students. Each house has its own dormitories and common room. In Slytherin House, the first years share 2 to a room. Alistair's roommate is a boy called Simon Wood. We have a house point system. It helps to reward good behavior and discourage rule breaking. The differences are that we have never had a fagging system, and there is no bullying, for various reasons." Severus decided that was probably enough detail and continued. "For the first month or so, we decide on who they share a room with. This is mostly so those who are new to the wizarding world have someone to help them settle in. Simon's father is from a long line of wizards. His mother was born to a normal family. They are getting on very well, and Alistair is having no problems adapting. He seems particularly fond of exploding Snap and some of the other children's games that he's been introduced to."
"He has mentioned Simon a few times. Is he from a nice family?"
"I should say so, although they tend to be in Gryffindor House, so I have less contact with them than with most others. Mr. Wood works at the ministry, and Miss Wood teaches pre-Hogwarts age children at home. His cousin plays professional Quidditch and is a very good man."
"Do you think we could meet up with them? If the boys are becoming friends, I think I would like to."
"I can easily supply you with their address and telephone number," James said. He knew that they were connected to the Muggle telephone network, but he wasn't sure Severus did.
"Thank you. So tell me, has he been all right being away from home? He's never been away from me before, and I have worried that he'd be terribly upset about it all."
Alistair was a little homesick for the first few nights, which is a perfectly normal reaction for an 11-year-old away from home for the first time, and he was by no means the only one. He got over it very quickly, and now seems perfectly happy. He's adapted admirably to his life at the school, and we've brought you his report in person, so we can help you understand it. He took a small booklet out of the pocket of his robes and put it on the table. It was a fancy affair compared to those James had seen his cousin bring home from Smeltings. He, of course, had never been aware Hogwarts even compiled reports, his aunt and uncle not being inclined to discuss it with them. The front sheet held the school coat of arms. Severus opened it to the first page. This is a summary of his grades in each subject. Each teacher has written a more detailed report later on. If James could go over this with you, I will arrange for some refreshments to be brought through." James moved around the table so he was next to Mrs. MacDonald. As soon as Severus had left, she looked at him suspiciously.
"You look very young for a teacher."
"I'm 24, Mrs. MacDonald. I assure you that I am well qualified for my subject."
"What do you teach?"
"Defense against the dark arts. It is an interesting subject. We look at various animals and creatures and start the basics of dueling."
"Isn't that a little dangerous?"
"Dueling? Not really. I believe fencing is taught quite often at schools. Think of it as much along the same lines. There's a lot of formality involved, but it's very enjoyable and excellent exercise."
"What qualifications do you have?"
"I finished my schooling in wizardry early at the age of 16 and went back to the normal world to take A-levels in maths, history, IT, German, and French. Then I was invited to attend a wizarding university. I took a 4-year course there, graduating with an honors degree, just as almost all of the other members of staff have. Do you wish to look at the report now? It will be quite different from ones Alistair will have received at his junior school, since we have a different grading system."
"Very well."
"Do you understand what each subject involves?"
"Not exactly."
"I've explained defense already. I teach Alistair that, and he's a very able pupil. I've graded him O. That's an outstanding, and the equivalent of an A grade, the top mark. Potions is taught by Professor Snape, and that's similar to chemistry. The students learn to make a huge variety of potions, including ones for healing. It's a very highly praised ability. Professor Snape gives children from non-wizarding families tutoring at the beginning of term to make sure they are not at a disadvantage to the other students. He's given Alistair an EE, exceeds expectations. That's the next grade down from an O, and a very respectable mark, especially since he's known for being a harsh grader.
And the next subject, transfiguration.
Turning one thing into something else. They start out small, matches into needles and the like, but the masters in transfiguration, like Professor McGonagall, can even change themselves at will into animals. She's given him an O, most impressive. It's one of the hardest branches of magic. Charms is next on the list. That's perhaps one of the most useful subjects, since students are taught a huge variety of charms, many of which can be used around the household. There are charms for lifting things up, for tidying, packing, cleaning, and so on. He's received an EE in charms. Again, very good. Herbology is a bit like a cross between biology and gardening. You learn to look after magical plants. They are quite difficult to raise, and it's quite a challenging subject. He's received an A for this, an acceptable grade. That's a pass, showing he's solid in the subject and doing fine, but has no particular gift for it. Severus came back into the room, a tray of tea and cakes floating behind him. "Finished?" he asked. "Almost," James replied, as he hastily continued through the rest of the subjects. Mrs. MacDonald seemed very concerned that her son was performing to the best of his ability, even if it made her come over as a little pushy. James could just about understand her concern over his youth. He did probably appear more like a teenage rebel than a teacher to her muggle eyes with his long hair. She seemed much friendlier towards Severus, who was older, had a huge amount of presence, and a natural air of authority. Towards the end of the afternoon, they had already been speaking for 2 hours, putting to rest as many of her concerns as they could. James asked, "Have you been receiving letters all right?"
By owl, you mean? Now that really was strange. I'm a little afraid of the birds myself, but Owlie seems very fond of his. I bought him one when he got his school supplies, and I have to say, it's very efficient. I'm not sure I'm feeding it right, though.
"He'll certainly be fed at Hogwarts in the owlery. Otherwise, there are mice and owl treats you could buy. Shall I go and pick some up for you before you leave?" James asked. Severus nodded, and James pulled on his cloak and left, leaving Severus to deal with everything. He was promising to make sure Alistair was wearing thermal underwear.
It can get so cold up north.
And wearing a scarf.
A lovely shade of red that no Slytherin would consider putting on, let alone wear in public.
By the time he returned, they seemed to have finished and were just getting ready to leave. He handed her a neatly wrapped parcel. "I've put some stasis charms on to keep them fresh for as long as you want to keep them."
Thank you so much, young man.
He nodded politely to her and watched as Severus let her out. He returned a few moments later. "Parents," he muttered irritably. "The poor man had been forced to be nice all afternoon." "I never knew mine," James said lightly, "so I wouldn't know. My aunt and uncle couldn't have cared less. My mother died young. My father was unpleasant, to say the least. Still, there are times I think I am better off without." "What, you mean you don't want to wear a Gryffindor scarf?" That poor child. The next Saturday, the door of the staff room burst open. The teachers looked up, a few going automatically to their wands. Hermione Weasley burst in, eyes shining, a sheet of paper clutched in her hand. "You're early, Hermione," James said, highly amused by her enthusiasm. "It's only 2 o'clock. What's up?"
"I think I found it."
"Let's see." She came round to stand next to him, putting her slip of paper down on the desk.
"It's from Arsene's Jiggers, Gryffindor and Slytherin, friend or foe. Percy had a copy, so I borrowed it."
"With or without asking?"
Anyway, listen.
The combined Slytherin and Gryffindor force built for itself a great fortress which could hold and support all of the clan's allies, dependents, and warriors in time of crisis. This location of fortress was protected by a Fidelius charm. Only a member of the Gryffindor or Slytherin bloodline could take a stranger through the wards. The only ones exempt from this were those born within the castle itself. The geographical location has been much discussed, although they have not been able to be tested. In many documents of the time, Salazar Slytherin has been described as coming from the Fens, modern-day Norfolk. The Gryffindor family, from Wild Moor, would have originated in Yorkshire. Together, the two families controlled the majority of this part of Britain, their main rivals in power being the Delaney Podmore family of Cornwall, the last remaining member of which is the ghost now leading the headless hunt, Sir Patrick Delaney Podmore. The fortress, as one of the defenses against the forces of this family, would have been located between the two territories, therefore taking into account other political alliances in Cambridgeshire.
This is it, James! We found it!
Hermione, that's only the general area.
No, it goes on to give a few more details, such as its height over surrounding land, it being on a river, and its proximity to the coast, and I think I've managed to pinpoint an exact site. It's marked as being a quarry on Muggle maps, so I imagine that Muggle repelling charms are still in effect, and it would only take seconds to operate there.
Do you have a map with you? Hermione gave him a scathing look and took a new Ordnance Survey 1 map out of her bag. She unfolded it over his desk. As she did so, Severus and Draco came to look over their shoulders. Putting a hand-drawn map of the UK on top of it, she sketched on the various alliances' territories and her theory for the location of the fortress, showing them where it corresponded on the map. The men exchanged glances. "This sounds like it should work," Draco said doubtfully. "But it can't be that easy, can it?"
Easy? Do you know how long it took me to find that one reference? Do you know how rare that book is? How long he had to research to find that much information?
James and Severus backed carefully away. They summoned a house elf and requested enough food to last them overnight if necessary. If the castle really was there, they doubted any of them would want to leave without exploring it thoroughly. James wasn't surprised that it seemed the two Slytherins intended to accompany them. He was excited himself. By the time Hermione had finished with Draco, he was a nervous wreck, and the others had almost finished their preparations. Hermione," James said carefully, "we're just going to go and change into clothes that would be more suited for this, okay? We'll meet you at the apparition point in 50 minutes. She smiled at him, at once all excitement again.
You've got food. Great. Get Draco sorted too, and I'll see you there.
James bounded out of the room and equipped himself in battle robes, just as he had for the trip to Malfoy Manor. Even if the fortress could only be found by one of the bloodlines, who was to say the last documents hadn't left some nasty traps, or that there wasn't anyone already living there? At the apparition point, he met up with the others, all similarly attired, and they took down the apparition coordinates of the small village near the quarry. It would have been risky to attempt apparition straight to the site in case of any wards that had been erected. They arrived, with a pop, in a quiet lane and followed the road, little more than a mud track, really, down to the danger signs marked Quarry. Taking a deep breath, James stepped forwards and immediately met with a slightly resistance, as if he was trying to walk through water. He stepped back, puzzled. "Well, there's definitely something there, but I don't know how to get through the wards." "Sometimes wards are blood-linked," Severus said reasonably. "When a child of the family is born, they are taken to the boundary and a few drops of blood are let fall to the ground to seal them to the wards. That might work." James made a mental inventory and came up with a blank. "Does anyone have a dagger that isn't poisoned?" he asked sheepishly. Severus shook his head. As James had expected, he probably had a nasty variety of potions on his. Draco drew one from his belt and handed it over. Taking a deep breath, James forced his way back into the ward. He made a shallow cut on his arm and squeezed it enough for some blood to fall. Suddenly he was encased in a silver glow, and a small snake encircled his cut wrist. It curled itself tightly around his arm, then vanished with the glow. He looked down at his arm, seeing only unbroken skin. The resistance had vanished. James looked towards his friends. "I'm in," he said. "Now does anyone know how I can bring you in?" "Sometimes physical contact," Draco suggested tentatively. "Worth a try." James put a hand on Draco's shoulder and tried to walk him through. After a moment, Draco stepped back. "It's like walking into a brick wall," he said in disgust. "I think you'd better go on, James. We'll see you back at Hogwarts. When you've worked out what to do, we can have a field trip."